Korean Mafia boss chose his black mistress over his pregnant wife. After party he saw he lost their twins. A phone vibrates against a glass table in a penthouse suite overlooking the glittering spine of Seoul's night skyline. The screen reads, "Wife, 22 missed calls, 9 unread messages, 1 voicemail marked urgent." Kang Tae-hoon, the man people only ever whispered about, never named aloud, glanced at that screen for exactly 3 seconds. Then he lifted his glass, turned his gaze across the table, and smiled at Delilah. Now here is what you need to understand. At that exact moment, 11:12 p.m., in a quiet villa on the outskirts of Itaewon, his wife Amaka was no longer standing. She was on the floor, 8 months pregnant, with twins, alone, her body trembling under contractions that had stopped coming in waves and were now constant. A single, crushing, unbroken pressure that her body was never meant to carry without help. She had called him 22 times. He had not answered once. By 1:03 a.m., Amaka had already delivered the first twin. Alone. On the floor of their villa. By the time the ambulance arrived at 1:29 a.m., trained hands rushed to save the second. They were too late. One twin was breathing. The other was not. And at 3:48 a.m., when Kang Tae-hoon finally checked his phone, still wearing the same suit, still carrying the scent of whiskey and another woman's perfume, there were 37 missed calls waiting for him. He had missed the birth. He had missed the death. He had missed everything. If the story doesn't shake you to your core, nothing will. Subscribe to Seoul Drama Stories right now and turn on notifications, because what happens next to this man, it doesn't just change him, it dismantles him, piece by piece, in ways that money, power, and silence cannot fix. So how does a man who controls the shadow economy of an entire city lose the one thing no amount of influence could ever buy back? It starts 6 hours earlier. And it starts with a lie he had been telling himself for years. Let's talk about Kang Tae-hoon for a moment, because before you watch this man fall, you need to understand exactly what kind of man he was. Tae-hoon was not loud. He had no reason to be. At 38, he had built something most men only read about in cautionary tales. A network that touched private finance, underground logistics, border influence, and if you said it carefully enough in the right room, the decisions of people who were supposed to be untouchable. He moved money the way weather moves, invisibly, inevitably, leaving evidence only in what it changed. He never raised his voice. He never repeated himself. When he entered a room, conversations didn't stop from fear of violence. They stopped from fear of irrelevance. Being overlooked by Kang Tae-hoon was a sentence. Being noticed by him was a different kind of trap. His world was precise. His empire was invisible. His name was never written anywhere it could be found. And yet, everywhere that mattered, it was already understood. He was the silent architect of Seoul's underground economy. And at home, in a villa he had chosen, furnished and rarely slept in, his pregnant wife Amaka waited. She had waited through the first trimester when the meetings ran long. She had waited through the second when the calls stopped coming before midnight. She waited now, in her 8th month, carrying 2 lives that were half his, because waiting was the only language their marriage had left. That evening, his most trusted man had delivered 2 updates before the night began. The first was business. The second was Amaka, contractions since the afternoon, asking if he would be home by 9. Tae-hoon's response was 5 words. She's 8 months. She's fine. But she wasn't fine. And the reason he didn't go back, the reason that single night became the fault line that split everything after it, wasn't strategy. It wasn't business. It wasn't the meetings or the alliances or the carefully engineered power moves he had spent months constructing. The reason had a name, and she was already waiting for him at the party. The penthouse suite had no address on any public record. No listing. No name on the door. Just a private elevator that required a code and the kind of lighting that made everything look like a decision you could justify in the morning. This was where Seoul's real weight was carried. Not in offices, not in boardrooms. Here, over aged whiskey and agreements made in low voices that nobody would ever repeat. Tae-hoon arrived composed. He always arrived composed. The meeting was already in motion. Figures from networks that extended beyond Seoul, men who controlled influence he had been quietly maneuvering toward for months. This was the night it was supposed to consolidate. But seated across the room in a way that made the rest of the room feel like background was Delilah. Now, and this is where you need to pay very close attention. Delilah was not a coincidence. To understand what Delilah was to Kang Tae-hoon, you first have to understand what Amaka had become. Not through fault, not through failure, but through the slow, quiet mathematics of a life shared with a man who had never learned how to be present without also being in control. Amaka was brilliant, warm, the kind of woman who made every room feel inhabited rather than just occupied. She had loved Tae-hoon before the empire expanded. Before his name carried weight in rooms she was never invited into. She had loved him when loving him was still a simple thing, before the silences grew longer, before the distance between them started measuring itself not in kilometers but in conversations that never happened. But somewhere in the second year of their marriage, Tae-hoon had stopped seeing her as a partner. He had started seeing her as a mirror. And the man reflected back, the husband, the father-to-be, the man with obligations and accountability and a life that demanded softness he didn't know how to give, was a man he did not want to be. So he stopped looking. Delilah had not arrived in his life like a storm. She arrived like a tide. Slowly, consistently, in ways you don't notice until the shoreline has already changed. They had met 18 months ago through a business introduction. She was consulting for a private equity group with interests that briefly intersected with one of Tae-hoon's financial channels. Nigerian Korean, raised between Lagos and Busan, educated in London, fluent in Yoruba, Korean, and English, and even more fluent in the one language that mattered most in rooms like his, the language of reading people before they read you. She had not flirted with him at that first meeting. That was the thing he remembered most later. Every other woman in proximity to his world either wanted something visible from him or performed disinterest so poorly it became its own form of want. Delilah had done neither. She had disagreed with him calmly, precisely, with data he hadn't considered on a point about port logistics in Busan. She had been right. She had known she was right. And she had moved on without making him feel the loss of the argument. He had thought about that for 3 days afterward. The second meeting was professional. The third was less so. By the fourth, the lines had not yet crossed. But they had bent in ways that only one of them was pretending not to notice. She never pushed. That was her architecture. Patience dressed as ease. She let him come to her, and she let him believe it was entirely his idea, and she created a space around herself that felt so effortless, so free of the weight that waited for him everywhere else, that stepping into it felt less like a choice and more like exhaling after holding his breath for years. Around Delilah, Tae-hoon was not a boss. He was not a husband. He was not the man who was about to become a father to 2 children he hadn't yet admitted terrified him. He was just a man, unscheduled, unaccountable, unburdened by the version of himself that the rest of the world needed him to be. She never asked about Amaka, not because she didn't know, she knew. She had always known. But she had understood, with the kind of precision that came from watching men like him for years, that the moment she made him choose in words was the moment she lost the advantage. So she never named it. She never framed it. She simply made herself the easier place to be. And for a man like Tae-hoon, ease was the most dangerous addiction in the world. At 9:47 p.m., his phone lit up on the table beside him. Not Amaka this time. Delilah. She was across the room, already moving toward the bar, and still. She had sent him a message. Just 3 words. "You look tired." He typed back in under 4 seconds. For seconds. The same man who had watched 22 of Amaka's calls expire into voicemail without a single muscle in his face shifting. That man typed back to Delilah in 4 seconds, without thinking, without hesitation, the way you respond to something that feels like home even when you know it isn't. He didn't notice the irony. Or perhaps he did, somewhere deep and unexamined, and that was precisely why he didn't look at it directly. The truth he had never said aloud, not to Delilah, not to any of the men who served him, certainly not to Amaka, was that fatherhood frightened him in ways that business never had. Business was controllable. Money moved in patterns. Power, once understood, could be maintained. Even loss in the underground world operated by rules he had spent 2 decades learning to navigate. But a child? 2 children? 2 lives that would arrive needing things from him that had no structure, no precedent, no system he could build around them. 2 lives that would look at him and see not the man who ran Seoul's shadow economy, but simply a father, and find him either sufficient or lacking, with no negotiation in between. Amaka knew this about him. She had tried, gently, more than once, to tell him that the fear was normal, that it didn't make him weak, that becoming a father wasn't the same as losing himself. But Tae-hoon didn't know how to receive that kind of softness without feeling cornered by it. So he had gone quiet when she offered it, and she had eventually stopped offering, and the distance between them had filled in with the particular silence of 2 people who had stopped trying to reach each other at the same time. Delilah had never tried to reach him at all, and somehow that felt safer. At 10:31 p.m., Amaka called again. The phone buzzed against the table once, twice. The 3rd time, Tae-hoon's eyes moved to the screen without his permission. Wife. Something moved in his chest. Not quite guilt, not quite recognition, but something in the neighborhood of both. Something he had learned to close a door on quickly before it could fully form. He reached out and silenced it. The screen went dark. Delilah reappeared at his side, setting a glass in front of him, her presence carrying that particular warmth she always brought. Unhurried, uncomplicated, requiring nothing from him except his company. "You went somewhere just now," she said, not as an accusation, more like an observation, the way you'd note that a window had been left open. "I'm here," he said, and he meant it. That was the tragedy of it, he genuinely meant it. In that room, with that woman, he was fully, completely present in a way he had not been in his own home in over a year. Across the city, in a villa growing too quiet, his phone number was being dialed for the 23rd time. He didn't feel it. He had stopped feeling it the moment he decided that being here was easier than being there. And ease, for Kang Tae-hoon, had always won, until the night it cost him everything. At 10:44 p.m., the contraction came without warning. Not the dull, rolling pressure that had been building since late afternoon. The kind Amaka had been breathing through quietly, alone, telling herself was normal, telling herself was manageable, telling herself would pass. This was different. This arrived like something structural giving way, a deep, seizing pain that moved from her lower back and wrapped around her entire abdomen like a fist closing. She gripped the edge of the bedroom dresser, breathed, counted, waited for it to pass. Passed. But it left something behind, a residue of certainty she had been trying all evening to avoid. The babies were coming. Not in 2 weeks. Not next week. Tonight. She reached for her phone and called Tae-hoon. It rang 7 times. Voicemail. She set the phone down carefully, the way you set things down when your hands are shaking and you don't want to drop them. She moved to the window, pressed her palm flat against the cool glass, and looked out at the empty driveway below. The car should have been there. Mr. Beck, Tae-hoon's driver, technically, though she had used him more in the last 2 months than Tae-hoon had, should have been on call. She dialed his number. The line connected immediately. Mrs. Kang. His voice was careful, practiced. I've been reassigned for the evening. Mr. Kang requested. Where are you? A pause. The kind of pause that carries an answer inside it. I'm downtown, ma'am. I can try to. How long? At least 40 minutes. Maybe more. Traffic is. She hung up. 40 minutes. She did the math against the contractions that were already returning sooner than they should have been, and the math did not comfort her. She tried the housekeeper next. The call went unanswered. She remembered, distantly, that she had given the woman the evening off. A small kindness extended 3 days ago when the week had felt manageable and the due date had still felt like a future event. She tried the other number, the secondary staff line, and got nothing. The house was empty. She stood in the middle of the bedroom and understood, fully, in a way that required no further confirmation, that she was alone. Not temporarily alone. Not the kind of alone that resolves itself in 20 minutes when someone walks through the door. The kind of alone that has already made its decision and settled in. She called Tae-hoon again. 11 times in 14 minutes. Voicemail. 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 On the 12th call, she didn't leave a message. She just stayed on the line after the beep, breathing, because some part of her needed him to hear at least that. The sound of her trying, the sound of the air moving in and out of a woman holding herself together through sheer refusal to collapse. Then the next contraction hit. And this one was not like the others. At 11:52 p.m., Amaka lowered herself to the bathroom floor. Not a decision exactly. More like her body issuing a directive her mind was too overwhelmed to argue with. The tiles were cold. She registered that distantly. Cool against her palms, cool against her knees, cool in a way that briefly anchored her to something outside the pain. She had read the books. She had attended the appointments, alone, most of them, though Tae-hoon had appeared at the early ones when the pregnancy was still new enough to feel like something you showed up for. She had prepared. She had done everything right. None of it had prepared her for this. The contractions were no longer discrete events with space between them. They were overlapping now, one beginning before the last had fully released, building pressure that didn't ebb the way it was supposed to, and underneath all of it, underneath the pain and the breathing and the counting, was a fear she hadn't allowed herself to name until this moment. Something was wrong. She dialed emergency services. Her voice, when she spoke, surprised her. Steady, measured, precise. She gave her address without faltering. She described the contractions, the timing, the pregnancy week count, the number of babies. The operator told her to stay calm, told her help was coming. She said, "Please hurry." And then she set the phone down and tried Tae-hoon one more time. 20-second call. Voicemail. She did not leave a message this time. She sat on the bathroom floor of a house that cost more than most people earned in a decade, in a city where her husband controlled enough influence to move mountains, and she understood, quietly, completely, without drama, that he was not coming. Not because he couldn't, because he had chosen not to. The choice had been made hours ago, in some room she would never see, in a moment she would never be shown. She didn't know the details. She didn't need them. The details were irrelevant. What mattered was the result, and the result was this: the floor, the cold tiles, the contractions arriving now like something trying to break through her, and the absolute crystalline certainty that she was delivering these children without him. She pressed her back against the cabinet beneath the sink and breathed. Across the city, in the penthouse suite with the floor-to-ceiling glass and the low amber light, laughter rose briefly above the music. Tae-hoon was leaning back in his chair, glass in hand, the conversation around him moving in the easy, unhurried way of men who had nothing urgent waiting for them. The alliance meeting had concluded. Director Choi had left satisfied. The groundwork for a financial expansion that would extend Tae-hoon's reach beyond Seoul for the first time had been quietly, efficiently laid. It had been a good evening. Delilah was speaking now. Something about a trip she had taken to Jeju the previous spring, a story he had heard fragments of before, told differently each time in ways that made it feel new. She had a gift for that, for making familiar things feel undiscovered, for making him feel like a man experiencing things for the first time rather than a man repeating choices he had already made too many times to count. He was laughing when his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen without picking it up. Wife. He had stopped feeling the pull of it hours ago. The first few calls had registered somewhere in him, a low, distant vibration of something that might, in a different version of himself, have been urgency. But he had learned, across months of practice, how to let that vibration quiet itself, how to redirect his attention before it could develop into something that required action. He was good at that. He turned the phone face down. Delilah's hand rested briefly near his on the table. Not a gesture, not a signal, just a presence. Warm, uncomplicated, requiring nothing. "You disappeared again," she said softly. "I'm here," he said. The phone screen lit up beneath his palm and went dark. He did not turn it over. At 1:03 a.m., 31 minutes after his wife's water broke onto the bathroom floor of their empty villa, Amaka delivered the first twin alone. Tae-hoon was still laughing. The second twin was in trouble, and he didn't know, because he had turned his phone face down and kept it there. There is a particular kind of silence that isn't peaceful. It doesn't rest. It doesn't comfort. It doesn't settle over a room the way silence is supposed to, softly, gradually, like something earned at the end of a long day. This silence was the other kind. The kind that presses. The kind that reminds you, in every second it holds, that a sound should be here and isn't. That a voice should be answering and won't. That somewhere between the 23rd call and the 37th, something had already been decided. Not by fate, not by medicine, not by any force that carried the dignity of being named, but by a man who had turned his phone face down and chosen not to know. In the villa on the outskirts of Itaewon, Amaka knew. Not in the way you know a fact. In the way your body knows something before your mind will allow it. Settling into the truth the way water settles into the lowest available space. Quietly, completely, without drama. He wasn't coming. By midnight, she had moved from the bed to the floor without fully deciding to. Her body had made the decision. Some deep animal intelligence had pulled her down toward the ground, toward something solid, something that wouldn't shift beneath her. She had taken towels from the bathroom. She couldn't remember exactly when, and they were beneath her now, and the pain had long since stopped being something that came and went and was simply everything, constant and total, occupying her entire body the way a sound occupies a room when it has nowhere left to go. She was not panicking. That was the thing about Amaka that no one who hadn't seen her in this kind of moment would have understood. She did not panic. She processed. Even now, on the floor of a villa that had always felt too large, too quiet, too much like a house that had been purchased rather than built into a home. Even now, she was thinking clearly, feeling everything, falling apart in no visible way. She had already called emergency services. They had said help was coming. She had repeated her address twice, her voice even, her breathing controlled in the spaces between contractions where control was still possible. She had tried Tae-hoon 4 more times after that. Voicemail, 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 voicemail. She stopped after the 4th. Not because she had given up, but because she understood, with a clarity that the pain could not blur, that she was now alone in a way that calling could not fix. He was not unreachable because of distance. He was unreachable because he had chosen to be. And there was a difference between those two things. A vast, unforgivable difference that she would carry long after this night was over. She put the phone beside her and focused on the only thing left that mattered. The first baby came at 1:03 a.m. There was no one there to receive him. No trained hands. No sterile equipment. No voice telling her to breathe, to push, to hold on. Just Amaka on the floor of a villa in Itaewon, bringing a life into the world with nothing but her own body and a silence so complete it felt like the room itself was holding its breath. She did what needed to be done. Quietly. Completely. With a steadiness that she would never fully be able to explain to anyone who asked, because explaining it would require putting language to something that existed entirely beyond language. A woman's body knowing what to do in the absence of everything else. He was small. He was here. He was breathing. She held him against her chest and she did not cry. Not yet. Because the second twin had not come. She knew immediately that something was wrong. Not from pain, the pain was beyond calibration now, beyond comparison. A single unbroken state of being rather than a sensation she could measure. She knew it the way you know when a room has changed even before you can identify what's different. A shift. An absence where a presence should be building. She called out to no one. She tried to move and couldn't. She looked at her phone on the floor beside her. Screen cracked from where it had slipped from her hands sometime in the last hour, and she tried to reach it and her arm didn't cooperate the way she needed it to. The first baby was against her chest, breathing in small, rapid pulls. And the second twin was silent in a way that had nothing to do with peace. The ambulance arrived at 1:29 a.m., 26 minutes after the first call. 26 minutes that were not the paramedics' fault. They had moved, they had come. But 26 minutes that would nonetheless become the fixed coordinate around which the rest of this story orbited. They came through the door and the scene rearranged them for a moment. Even trained people have a half-second of recalibration when reality exceeds the scenario they prepared for. Then they moved. Voices sharp and professional. Hands everywhere at once. Amaka told them there were 2. She said it clearly, without tears, her voice carrying the particular flatness of someone who has gone somewhere beyond the reach of ordinary emotion. Not numb, but resolved, already living in the aftermath of something she could feel but not yet fully name. They worked. Time in those minutes did not behave normally. It stretched in some places and compressed in others, The way time always behaves when the thing happening is too large for the regular pace of seconds to contain. They got her to the hospital. Trained hands took over. And the second twin, small, silent, already having spent too long in a world that had not been ready to receive him, did not respond the way the first had. At 2:41 a.m., the doctor came out of the delivery suite. She spoke to a nurse. Her voice was low and professional and carried the specific economy of language that people in her position develop, words chosen not for what they express but for what they can be clearly understood to mean without excess. The first twin was alive. Critical. In the NICU. Fighting in the particular silent way that newborns fight. Not with sound or movement but with the stubborn, unreasonable persistence of a life that has just arrived and refuses to accept that it might not stay. The second twin was gone. Amaka lay in a hospital bed and stared at the ceiling. She was conscious through all of it. That was the thing that no one who heard this story later could quite reconcile. She had been awake, aware, present for every second of a night that no person should have had to survive alone. She had felt everything, understood everything, lost everything with full awareness and no one beside her to absorb even a fraction of the weight. She didn't scream. She didn't collapse. She simply lay there, in a hospital that smelled of antiseptic and fluorescent light, with one child fighting for his life in another room and one child already gone, and she stared at the ceiling and she breathed. The silence around her was different now. It wasn't the pressing, punishing silence of the villa. It was something emptier, something that had been hollowed out by what the night had taken and not yet filled with whatever came next. On a bedside table, her cracked phone screen had one notification. Not from Tae-hoon. From emergency services. A system-generated message confirming her case had been logged. She didn't touch it. There was nothing left to reach for. 37 missed calls. One voicemail marked urgent. A man in a suit, smelling of whiskey and someone else's presence, was only now beginning to drive. He had no idea what silence, left long enough, was capable of taking. It was the quiet that reached him first. Not a sound. The absence of one. The penthouse had thinned out past 3 a.m. The meetings concluded, the agreements sealed in the wordless way that men like Tae-hoon preferred, the ambient noise of the evening retreating into the particular stillness that expensive rooms hold after the people inside them have finished performing for each other. Delilah had stepped away briefly, and in that unguarded moment, no conversation to anchor him, no presence to orient himself toward. Tae-hoon reached for his glass and his hand brushed his phone instead. He picked it up without intention. Reflex, nothing more. The screen came alive. 37 missed calls. 9 messages. 1 voicemail marked urgent. All from a number saved under a single word. Wife. He looked at the screen for a long moment. The first thing he felt was irritation. He recognized it clearly, that specific tightening across the back of his jaw, the mild, practiced impatience of a man who had organized his entire life around not being interrupted by things that could wait. She knew what these evenings required. She knew the rhythms of his work. He had told her before midnight. He had been clear. He scrolled through the missed calls without opening the messages. 37 calls in a span of, he checked the timestamps, 4 hours. The irritation shifted. Not gone, but rearranged. Something moving behind it. Something he didn't immediately have a name for, pressing upward through the layers of composure he had spent decades constructing. He opened the first message. Tae-hoon. The contractions are getting worse. Please come home. The second. I need you. Please. The third. Timestamped 12:08 a.m. I'm calling emergency services. The pain is. Please just call me back. He stopped reading. He pressed play on the voicemail. Amaka's voice came through the speaker and something in the quality of it, the specific texture of it, the way it sat just beneath panic without crossing into it, the way it carried pain and control simultaneously in a combination that only someone running out of both could produce, moved through him in a way that bypassed every defense he had ever built. Please. I need you. I can't. The message cut off. Mid-sentence. Mid-breath. As though whatever was happening on the other end had pulled her away before she could finish, or as though she had simply run out of the energy required to keep asking. Tae-hoon stood very still. The irritation was gone now. The confusion was gone now. What had replaced them had no clean name. It was not panic. Panic required a belief that the situation could still be reversed, and something in his body, some system more honest than his conscious mind, had already received the information and begun processing it in the place beneath language where truth lives before it becomes thought. He was already moving before the voicemail finished. He drove himself. That was the detail that would stay with him longest. Not because it was heroic, but because it was automatic, the decision of a man whose system had bypassed calculation entirely and was operating on something rawer. No call to a driver. No instruction to anyone. Just Tae-hoon in the parking structure beneath the building, alone, in a suit that still carried the evening on it. The amber lighting of the penthouse, the particular scent of aged whiskey, and underneath everything else, faint but present and irrefutable, the trace of Delilah's perfume against the fabric of his jacket. 15 minutes to the hospital. He made it in 9. He would never remember the drive. Not a single second of it. Not the roads or the lights or the speed. Only the arriving, the hospital entrance, the fluorescent wash of the emergency bay, the particular brightness that hospitals deploy against the dark regardless of what hour it is, as though light itself can hold things at bay if there's enough of it. He walked in still wearing everything the night had put on him. There was no time to be anything other than exactly what he was. The doctor met him in the corridor before he could ask for anyone. Professional. Composed. The kind of composed that comes from delivering news that cannot be softened and has long since stopped being attempted. She looked at him once, taking in the suit, the hour, the fact that he had arrived this way, and her expression didn't change. She had seen versions of this before. Men who arrived late. Men who arrived carrying the evidence of where they had actually been. She did not comment on any of it. Mr. Kang. My wife, he said. Your wife is stable. Pause measured not in seconds but in weight. One of the twins is in the NICU. He's critical, but he is breathing. Tae-hoon's chest moved once. The word he registered somewhere. A son, he was processing a son, and then the doctor's next words arrived and everything else stopped. The second twin did not survive. The silence that followed was different from every silence Tae-hoon had ever commanded. In his world, silence was a tool. It was what he reached for when other men reached for words. It was the space he created to make people uncertain, to shift the weight of a room, to communicate authority without the vulnerability of language. This silence was none of those things. This silence was what happened when the structure that a man has built his entire identity around, control, composure, the unassailable certainty that he can manage outcomes, encounters something that simply will not be managed. He did not collapse. He did not shout. He stood in a hospital corridor in a suit that smelled of someone else's life, and he absorbed the information the way a structure absorbs damage. Not falling, not yet, but with something irreversible now running through the foundation. Where is my wife? He asked. His voice was level, automatic. The voice of a man whose instrument of control was all he had left to reach for. The nurse beside the doctor hesitated. That hesitation, small, almost imperceptible, the brief pause of someone who had been given an instruction they found uncomfortable to deliver, told him everything before the words arrived. Mrs. Amaka has requested that you not be permitted into her room. He stood there. Kang Tae-hoon. The man who moved money across borders without signing his name. The man whose silence made officials reconsider their positions and whose approval entire networks of people organized their behavior around. He stood in a hospital corridor at 4 a.m. and he was not permitted into a room. Not because of locked doors. Not because of security. Not because of any force in the world that his influence could touch or his resources could negotiate with. Because the woman inside had asked. And her asking was the one authority in this building, in this moment, in this version of the world that the night had produced, that was absolute. No call he could make would change it. No name he could invoke. No leverage. No architecture of power. Just a closed door and a woman on the other side of it who had already made her decision in the hours he had spent making his. He found a chair in the corridor. He sat down. No phone calls. No orders relayed in low voices to waiting men. No machinery of influence set quietly into motion. Just a man in an empty hallway, still wearing the suit, still carrying the scent of the evening on him, beginning slowly without drama, in the way that real understanding always arrives, not as a strike but as a weight, to understand what he had done. Outside, the city continued. The underground economy he had built kept moving, as it always did, indifferent to any single man's grief. And behind a closed door at the end of the corridor, Amaka breathed. Alone still, but this time by choice. The most powerful man in the building had become the least important person in it. And somewhere down the hall, in a room full of machines and careful hands, a small life fought on, the one witness to a night his father would spend the rest of his life trying to answer for. She did not speak to him that day, or the next, or the one after that. And Tae-hoon, a man who had spent 2 decades filling silences with authority, with instruction, with implication, with the particular weight of a presence that made other people move before he asked them to, had absolutely nothing to say to a silence like hers. Because Amaka's silence was not passive. It was not the silence of a woman who had nothing left to say. It was not grief made voiceless, or pain that had retreated into numbness. It was deliberate, architectural, built with the same precision she had always possessed and sharpened now into something that had edges. She had looked at him once, on the second day, when he had been standing in the hallway outside her ward for the 3rd consecutive hour and a nurse had opened the door briefly for a routine check and their eyes had met for exactly 2 seconds through the gap. She had looked at him the way you look at something you once trusted and no longer do. Not with hatred. Hatred would have meant he still occupied space in her emotional world that mattered. This was worse than hatred. This was recognition. Clear, quiet, and completely unmoved. Then the door had closed, and he had stood in that hallway for another hour, alone, understanding for the first time in his adult life what it felt like to have no available move. On the 4th day, a woman arrived at the hospital. She was composed, professional, carrying a leather folder and the particular manner of someone who had delivered difficult information to powerful people before and had not once been intimidated by the experience. She introduced herself to the attending nurse, who directed her to the waiting area where Tae-hoon had taken up a now familiar position. Sitting, without entourage, without his phone in his hand, without the performance of authority he wore everywhere else. She sat across from him. She placed a single document on the table between them. "Mrs. Kang will not be meeting with you directly," she said. "She has asked me to represent her communication going forward. These are her terms." Tae-hoon looked at the document. He did not reach for it immediately. Old instinct, never let anyone see you need the information they're offering. But old instinct belonged to a man who still had leverage, and that man had left something irretrievable behind in a villa in Itaewon, and what remained was simply someone sitting across from a lawyer in a hospital hallway, wearing yesterday's clothes, trying to remember what posture felt appropriate. He picked up the document. He read it. The terms were 5 in number. Simple, precise. Written in the clean, unadorned language of someone who had thought about every word carefully and removed anything that could be mistaken for negotiation. The first, he would not attempt to contact Amaka directly. Not by phone, not in person, not through intermediaries other than her designated legal representative, until she initiated contact herself. There was no timeline attached to this condition. No expiración. It would end when she decided it ended and not before. The second, he would have no unsupervised contact with the surviving child. Visits would be scheduled through her lawyer, conducted in the presence of a designated third party, and could be revoked at her discretion without requirement of cause. The third, all association with Delilah, contact, communication, financial connection, professional intersection of any kind, would cease immediately and completely. Not reduced, not managed quietly. Ended. The fourth, he would not deploy his influence, his network, his resources, or any extension of his power to alter, accelerate, or interfere with any decision she made regarding her life, her legal standing, or her future. He would not make calls. He would not apply pressure. He would not use the machinery he had spent 2 decades building to smooth over what one night had broken. The fifth was the briefest. For words, "You will not fix this." The lawyer watched him red. She was experienced enough to know that men like Kang Tae-hoon typically responded to conditions in one of 2 ways, with controlled refusal dressed as reasonableness, or with the particular performance of compliance that was actually just a delay tactic, a regroup before the countermove. She had prepared for both. What she had not prepared for was what actually happened. He read the document to the end. He set it down on the table. He looked at it for a moment. Not at her, at the document, as if something in the language itself had caught him. And then he said, without hesitation, without qualification, without a single word of negotiation, "I agree." She paused. All 5 conditions. Immediately. Without modification. She had been in this profession for 11 years. She had represented women in rooms with men who controlled boardrooms, courtrooms, and in some cases the people who ran both. She had never once had a man of Tae-hoon's particular configuration agree to terms like these without at least attempting to reshape one of them. She wrote his confirmation in the margin. She asked him to initial beside each condition. He did. His hand was steady. That was the part that was hardest to explain later. His hand was steady. Not the steadiness of a man who was fine. The steadiness of a man who had nothing left inside him that was worth protecting. When there is no pride remaining to defend, the body stops performing composure and simply goes still. He left the hospital 2 hours later. Not because there was anywhere to go. Not because the world outside required him. But because staying had become a form of trespass, and for the first time in his life, he was unwilling to occupy a space he hadn't been given permission to enter. The car that collected him was the same one that had always collected him. Black, unmarked, the kind of vehicle that communicated power through the absence of decoration rather than its presence. His driver said nothing. His phone had 7 messages from people who ran parts of his operation and needed decisions made. He did not open any of them. He sat in the back of that car and looked out the window at Seoul moving past, the city he had quietly learned to control, the infrastructure of an empire built from silence and precision and the calculated application of influence, and he felt none of it. Because control, he was understanding now, was not something you possessed. It was something that was permitted to you, by circumstance, by the people around you who hadn't yet decided to take it back. Amaka had taken it back. Not loudly, not dramatically, with 5 conditions written on a single page, delivered by a woman in a leather chair. She had removed from Kang Tae-hoon the one thing his entire life had been constructed around. She had removed his ability to manage the outcome. And there was no counter to that. No route around it, no leverage point, no quiet call that could be made to someone who owed him something. She had anticipated that. Condition 4 had closed every door he might have reached for. She knew him. She had always known him. And she had written her terms in the language of that knowledge. Precisely, completely, in ways that only someone who had spent years watching a man operate could have constructed. That night, for the first time in longer than he could accurately remember, Tae-hoon sat in a room by himself with no agenda, no meeting to prepare for, no call to return, no move to make, just a man, in a room, alone with the specific weight of understanding that the empire he had built, the routes and the networks and the influence and the carefully maintained silence of it all, had not protected a single thing that actually mattered. His phone buzzed once. He looked at the screen. It was not Amaka. It was not the lawyer. It was Delilah. He stared at her name for a long moment. Then he set the phone face down on the table. Not the way he had done it that night in the penthouse, casually, with the ease of a man choosing comfort over responsibility. This time it was different. This time, something behind his eyes had already closed. He showed up. That was all, at first. That was the entirety of it. No grand gesture, no orchestrated moment of visible contrition, no carefully worded statement delivered to the right person through the right channel to ensure it landed with the maximum effect. Just a man arriving at a hospital every morning before the ward opened, sitting in a waiting area that had come to know the shape of him, and staying until the supervised window closed. He showed up. Day 1, Day 2, Day 3. By the end of the first week, the nurses on the NICU floor knew him by sight without knowing quite what to do with what they saw. Because the man who arrived each morning bore almost no resemblance to what his reputation described. He came alone. Always alone. No driver waiting visibly, no associate flanking him, none of the atmospheric architecture of importance that men like Kang Tae-hoon typically carried into rooms whether they intended to or not. He came in quiet clothes. He sat where he was told to sit. He did not make requests. He did not ask questions that implied he expected special accommodation. When the supervising third party arrived each morning, a woman appointed through Amaka's lawyer, composed and watchful and carrying the professional neutrality of someone paid to observe rather than judge. He greeted her with a single nod and nothing more. He had agreed to the terms. He kept them. The NICU window was small. That detail mattered in ways that were difficult to articulate but impossible to ignore. In every other room of Tae-hoon's life, scale communicated status, the floor-to-ceiling glass of his office, the width of conference tables, the particular spaciousness of rooms designed to make the person at the center of them feel large and permanent. This window was small, institutional, the kind of glass that existed to serve a function rather than make a statement. And through it, in a unit built entirely around the sustaining of lives too new and too fragile to sustain themselves, his son lay in an incubator surrounded by equipment that beeped in rhythms Tae-hoon did not yet know how to read. He was small. That was the word that kept arriving, unbidden. Every time Tae-hoon stood at that window, not as a medical assessment, not as comparison, just as a fact that refused to be absorbed quickly. He was so small. His hands, visible through the incubator's porthole panels, were the size of the space between Tae-hoon's thumb and forefinger. His chest rose and fell with an effort that should not have been effort, that in any other circumstance would not have been effort, but was visibly, constantly, a tiny body working harder than it should have had to simply to stay. Tae-hoon had never encountered anything he could not affect. Every problem in his life had been, at its core, a system, and every system, given enough intelligence and enough resources and enough patience, could be navigated, could be bent toward a preferred outcome. This was the fundamental operating principle of his entire existence, the belief beneath all other beliefs, so deeply embedded he had never needed to examine it because it had never once failed him. Until now, there was nothing to navigate here, no pressure point, no leverage, no call he could make, no route he could open, no silence he could weaponize. His son's lungs were doing what they were doing entirely independent of Kang Tae-hoon's influence, and all the underground architecture of Seoul's shadow economy could not add 1 milligram of strength to a chest that size. He was helpless, genuinely, completely, for the first time in his adult life, helpless. And instead of making him leave, the helplessness made him stay. By the second week, something in his behavior began to shift in ways that were small enough to overlook individually but accumulated into something the supervising third party noted quietly in her reports to Amaka's lawyer. He stopped arriving with the posture of a man tolerating conditions. He started arriving like a man who needed to be there. He stopped glancing at his phone during visits, not performing the restraint of someone resisting a habit, but genuinely, apparently uninterested in whatever the phone contained. Messages from his network went unanswered for hours. Decisions that would previously have required his immediate sign-off were delegated without instruction and not followed up on. He asked the NICU nurse on the 9th day what the beeping pattern meant. Not to be informed, not to assess or manage. He asked because he wanted to know, because the sound had been accompanying the most important hours of his recent life and he had not yet understood it, and that felt, suddenly, like an omission he needed to correct. The nurse explained. He listened. He asked one follow-up question. He thanked her. She mentioned it to a colleague afterward, not because it was dramatic, but because it was so thoroughly unremarkable that it stood out. A man asking a question and listening to the answer. That was all. But something in the quality of his attention had been different from the careful, calculating attention she associated with people who asked questions in order to gain something. He had simply listened, like someone learning rather than someone managing. He was learning, slowly, without a curriculum, without anyone to confirm he was doing it correctly. Just a man standing at a small window every morning, watching a small chest rise and fall, letting the experience of being unable to fix something teach him things that 2 decades of fixing everything had made it impossible to learn any other way. He showed up. That was all. That was everything. He did not know that across the city he was being watched. Not by Amaka. She had constructed her distance with precision and was maintaining it with a discipline that suggested she understood, perhaps better than anyone, that proximity to Tae-hoon's visible suffering was its own kind of trap. She had not asked for reports about his behavior at the hospital, though she received them. She read them without expression and filed them without comment. The watching came from somewhere else. Delilah had not disappeared when the terms were delivered. She had retreated. There was a difference, and she understood the difference better than most. Retreat was tactical. Created space without surrendering position. She had pulled back to the distance where she was no longer visible in the immediate landscape of his life, but could still observe its geography clearly. She watched the hospital visits through the information that moved quietly through the channels available to a woman with her particular intelligence and her particular patience. She noted the pattern of them, the consistency, the earliness, the aloneness. She noted what he was not doing. He was not reaching out to her. Not through intermediaries, not through the careful indirection that men in his position typically used when they wanted contact without accountability. He was not reaching. She sat with that information. She was not a woman who made decisions from emotion. She was a woman who made decisions from assessment, and what she was assessing now was a man in the middle of a transformation that could calcify in either direction, toward the version of himself that would eventually return to what was familiar, or toward something new that would have no use for what she offered. The calculation was not yet complete. But she was patient. She had always been patient. And men like Tae-hoon, even changed men, even men standing at NICU windows learning fragility for the first time, carried patterns inside them that ran deeper than any single season of grief. She would wait. She would watch. And when the moment came, if it came, she would not need to push. She would simply need to be there. He showed up on the 14th day, the same as the first. Before the ward opened. Alone. Quiet. He stood at the window for 40 minutes. His son's chest rose. His son's chest fell. And Kang Tae-hoon, the man who had built an empire on the principle that presence was power, stood there and let the smallest, most fragile presence he had ever encountered teach him what that word had always actually meant. It did not come as a message. Delilah was far too precise for that. A direct message, even a carefully worded one, even something constructed to appear entirely professional, would have been visible. It could be documented, forwarded, placed in front of a lawyer as evidence of a condition broken. And broken conditions were not in her interest. Not yet. Not while the situation was still fluid enough to be reshaped by patience rather than pressure. So it did not come as a message. Came as an opportunity. On the 17th day of Tae-hoon's hospital routine, his most senior associate, a man who had run the operational side of the network's financial channels for 6 years, appeared at the building where Tae-hoon had been staying and delivered a briefing that should have been routine. One of Tae-hoon's most significant holding structures, a private lending arrangement that touched 3 separate commercial developments across Gangnam, had encountered a complication. A party with competing interest in the same real estate corridor had entered the picture through an intermediary. The intermediary was a boutique consultancy based in Singapore with Seoul operations. The consultancy's lead advisor on the deal, according to the documentation his associate laid on the table, was a woman named Delilah. Tae-hoon read the name once. He set the document down. Who introduced them? He asked. His associate didn't know. Or said he didn't know, which in this world meant the same thing. Either the information wasn't available yet or it wasn't being offered freely. Both possibilities required the same response, which was patience and a willingness to let the shape of the thing reveal itself before reacting. Find out, Tae-hoon said. He said nothing else. He understood what it was immediately. Not because he was suspicious by habit, though he was, but because he knew her. He knew how she moved. He knew the architecture of her patience. And he recognized in the structure of this particular development the specific signature of a woman who had never once done anything without knowing exactly what she was building toward. She had not violated the terms directly. She had not contacted him. She had positioned herself carefully, deniably, with the kind of elegant indirection that boardrooms called strategy and called it nothing else, at the intersection of his professional world and her own. Close enough to create a reason for contact. Close enough to make avoidance look, from the outside, like a business decision rather than a personal one. It was a door. She had built him a door, and she had built it in a language, the language of deals and leverage and the recovery of control, that she knew with intimacy was the language he was most fluent in. She was offering him the thing he had been without for 17 days. Not herself. Not yet. Not directly. She was offering him the feeling of being the version of himself that operated rather than waited, that decided rather than observed, that moved the world rather than stood still inside it, watching a small chest rise and fall through institutional glass, stripped of every tool that had previously defined him. She was offering him his old identity back, and she had wrapped it in something he could not easily refuse without consequences he'd have to explain. He sat with it for 2 days. He did not make the call his associate was waiting for. He did not instruct anyone to reach out to the consultancy, to the intermediary, to any part of the chain that led back to her. He let the situation sit on the table the way you leave something potentially dangerous, with attention and without touch. What he noticed sitting with it was the pull. It was still there. He would have been dishonest with himself to deny it, and whatever Tae-hoon was becoming in these slow weeks, he had not yet become dishonest with himself. The pull was real. The appeal of stepping back into full operation, of being the person who resolved complications rather than the person who created them, was real. The relief it promised was not nothing. But underneath the pull was something he was only beginning to be able to name. Fear. Not of Delilah. Not of the professional complication she had engineered. Fear that the version of himself she was offering, the controlled, untouchable, unaccountable man who turned phones face down and made empires move in silence, was the version of himself that had cost his son a brother. He was afraid of going back to being that man. He was more afraid still that going back would feel like coming home. Amaka's lawyer received the NICU visit reports each week as part of the term's monitoring arrangement. She summarized them and forwarded them without editorial comment to Amaka, as instructed. Amaka read them. She had been reading them since the 2nd week, and what she read was consistent in a way she had not fully anticipated. Not because she had expected him to fail, but because she had not allowed herself to expect anything at all. Expectation, she had decided in the quiet of her hospital room in those first days, was a form of vulnerability she could not afford right now. But consistency was data. 17 consecutive days. Always before the ward opened. Always alone. Never a missed visit, never a shortened one, never any report of behavior that suggested performance rather than presence. She had not softened. She wanted to be clear with herself about that. Reading the reports was not softening. It was information management, and information management had always been something she was good at. But on the 18th day, she made a decision. She asked the supervising third party to deliver a message to Tae-hoon before his visit. The message was 3 sentences. He could have 15 additional minutes with the baby today. He could ask the NICU nurse questions about the child's progress directly. He would still be supervised. That was all. It was not forgiveness. It was not a gesture toward reconciliation. It was a woman making a calibrated, controlled decision to allow slightly more access based on evidence of behavior rather than on hope or emotion. She was precise about what it was. He was already at his usual position when the third party arrived and delivered the message. He read it. He stood still for a moment in the way he had been standing still more often lately. Not the stillness of a man suppressing reaction, but the stillness of a man actually feeling something and allowing himself to feel it without immediately converting it into action. Then he nodded. "Thank you," he said. The additional 15 minutes were quiet. The nurse answered his questions about the baby's breathing patterns, about the likely timeline for the incubator, about what the numbers on the monitors meant when they shifted. He listened to everything. He asked one follow-up question that indicated he had retained what she told him the week before, which she noted without comment. At the end of the visit, when the supervising third party indicated his time was complete, he turned from the window and began walking toward the exit. Amaka was in the corridor. He did not know she would be there. She had not planned to be there. She had come for her own scheduled visit, and the timing had simply, without design, converged. They both understood this immediately, and they both understood simultaneously that there was no protocol in place for this exact moment. They stopped. 3 meters between them. She looked at him. He looked at her. Not the 2-second glance through a doorway from the 2nd day. A full, unguarded moment of eye contact between 2 people who had shared a life and were now navigating whatever came after. He did not speak first. That was new. The old Tae-hoon would have spoken first, would have filled the silence reflexively, would have used words as a form of management. This man waited. He waited because he had learned, in 17 days at a small window, that some silences were not his to fill. Amaka looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, neutrally, without warmth but also without the closed quality that had characterized every previous interaction. He gained 12 grams this week. Tae-hoon absorbed this. I know, he said quietly. The nurse told me. A pause. Good, Amaka said. She walked past him toward the ward. He stood in the corridor and did not move for a long time. 3 meters. 12 grams. For words. It was the smallest possible thing. It was the first thing. And in the arithmetic of what they had broken and what might, slowly, painfully, without guarantee be rebuilt, it counted. Across the city, in a service department in Gangnam with a view of a skyline she had always known how to read, Delilah received a brief update from the intermediary. Tae-hoon had not responded to the business opening. She sat with this information, turned it once, assessed it without emotion the way she assessed everything. Then she opened her laptop and began drafting a different approach. She had not miscalculated. She had simply underestimated how long the hospital would hold him. That was adjustable. The realization did not arrive dramatically. It did not come in a moment of crisis, or at the edge of some consequential decision, or in the particular heightened atmosphere that stories tend to construct around the moments that change people. It came quietly, the way most true things come, in an ordinary moment without announcement, when the mind is still enough to finally hear what it has been circling for weeks. He was sitting in the hospital waiting area on the 23rd morning. Early as always, before the ward opened. The corridor was the particular quiet of a building not yet fully inhabited by the day, a cleaner moving at the far end, a nurse changing shifts at the station, the low persistent sound of equipment doing what equipment does regardless of the hour. Tae-hoon was not on his phone. He had a coffee he wasn't drinking, and he was thinking with the kind of unguarded honesty that only arrived when there was nothing left to protect, about Delilah. Not about her specifically, about what she had been. And the thing he arrived at slowly, without drama, with the quiet devastation of a conclusion that had been forming for weeks and had finally finished forming, was this: he had never chosen her. He had chosen what she made possible. He had chosen the version of himself that existed in her presence. Unaccountable, unobserved, released from the weight of becoming something he hadn't yet figured out how to be. She had not been the destination. She had been the exit. A door he had walked through not because of what was on the other side but because of what he was walking away from. Responsibility, fatherhood, the terrifying, uncontrollable reality of a life that needed him to show up as something he didn't know if he was capable of being. He had not chosen Delilah. He had chosen escape. And the difference between those two things, small on the surface, vast underneath, was the difference between a man who had been seduced and a man who had looked for a reason to go. He sat with that for a long time. The coffee went cold. He called his associate that afternoon and gave 3 instructions. The first, the holding structure complication would be resolved through a different intermediary. The consultancy with Singapore operations would be removed from any involvement in his affairs, effective immediately, with a standard dissolution clause that left no door open and no reason that required explanation. The second, any outstanding financial arrangement, however minor, however indirect, that connected his network to Delilah's professional orbit would be identified and closed within the week. The third, if she made contact again, directly, indirectly, through business channels or personal ones, he was not to be informed. The answer was no. The answer would always be no. His associate did not need to consult him each time. He needed to understand that the answer was structural now, not situational. His associate listened without interrupting. Understood, he said. Tae-hoon ended the call. He did not feel relief exactly. Relief implied the removal of something painful, and what he felt was quieter than that. More like the settling that happens when you stop carrying something you had been holding so long you had forgotten it had weight. She had offered him his old identity back. He had decided his old identity was not something he wanted to recover. He asked Amaka's lawyer, through the appropriate channel, for 15 minutes of direct communication with Amaka. Not a visit, not a negotiation. He was specific in the request. He wanted to speak to her once, briefly, without agenda. He would accept whatever conditions she placed on the conversation. He would not attempt to extend it beyond what she permitted. He was not asking for a response to anything he said. He simply needed to say something, and he wanted to say it to her rather than through the layered distance of legal representatives and monitored reports. The response came back the following day. 20 minutes. In a family consultation room adjacent to the NICU floor. The supervising third party would be present. Amaka reserved the right to end the conversation at any point without explanation. He accepted the terms. The room was small. 2 chairs and a table and the specific neutral quality of a space designed to contain difficult conversations without amplifying them. Amaka arrived after him, a deliberate choice he understood and did not comment on. She sat across the table. The supervising third party took a position near the door. Amaka looked at him with the expression he had come to recognize over these weeks as her default. Not hostile, not warm, but carefully level. The expression of a woman who had decided how much access her face was permitted to give. He did not reach for words immediately. That was the first thing she noticed, though she did not show it. The old Tae-hoon would have had the opening sentence ready before he sat down. He would have managed the room from the first moment. This man sat and found his words in real time, which meant the words were actually his. "I'm not here to explain myself," he said. "Explanation isn't what this needs." He paused. "What I did that night, what I chose, and what it cost. I can't place a word next to that and have the word mean anything. I know that. I'm not trying to." Another pause. Genuine. Not theatrical.
I'm sorry.
Not for what it cost me. For what it cost you. For what you went through alone that night. For the one we lost. I'm sorry in a way I don't have the right architecture to fully express, and I'm not going to pretend I do." He stopped. He had said what he came to say. He did not add to it. He did not cushion it with qualification or expand it into something that asked for a response. Amaka looked at him for a long moment. The room was very quiet. "I know," she said finally. Not, "I forgive you." Not, "It's enough." Not any of the things that stories tend to reach for in moments like this, because stories are uncomfortable with the space between acknowledgement and resolution. Just, "I know." 2 words that meant she had heard him, that the words had landed in the right place, that she was not going to pretend they fixed anything, and was not going to refuse them the dignity of being real. She stood. "The baby is being moved out of the incubator Thursday," she said. "Partially. They'll monitor the transition over 72 hours. She was telling him, not inviting him, not exactly, but telling him, which was its own form of something. A door not opened but perhaps no longer fully closed. She left. He sat in that small room for a few minutes after she was gone, and he let the conversation be exactly what it was. Not a turning point, not a redemption, not the moment everything changed. Just a real thing, said and received, between 2 people navigating the long and uncertain aftermath of an irreversible night. On Thursday, he was there. The incubator transition was a medical procedure, not a ceremony, and it was attended by the clinical staff whose job it was and not by anyone else. But afterward, in the short supervised window that Amaka's terms permitted, Tae-hoon was allowed, for the first time, to hold his son. The nurse placed the baby in his arms and gave him the standard instruction. Support the head, keep him close, stay seated. He did exactly that. His son weighed less than he expected. That was the thought that arrived first, not profound, not poetic, just the immediate physical fact of it. He weighed less than seemed possible for something that had fought this hard to stay. He was awake, not alert in the way adults are alert, but open, eyes unfocused, finding nothing in particular, present in the complete and undemanding way that newborns are present, requiring nothing from the person holding them except to not let go. Tae-hoon did not let go. He sat very still, in a chair in a room that smelled of antiseptic and recycled air, holding the smallest and most consequential thing he had ever been trusted with, and he did not move. He did not speak. He did not try to fill the moment with anything other than what it was. A man. A child. The fragile, unguaranteed present tense. Somewhere in the city, an empire ran without him. He didn't feel it. Was showing up enough? Or was this just the beginning of a lifetime debt? One that no consistency of presence, no sincerity of apology, no accumulation of quiet mornings in hospital corridors could ever fully balance. A debt measured not in days or gestures but in the permanent weight of a child who never came home, a wife who rebuilt herself alone on a floor in Itaewon, and a man who arrived too late to matter when it was the only time that ever truly counted? That is not a question this story can answer. It is the question Kang Tae-hoon will spend the rest of his life learning to live inside. And perhaps that not redemption, not forgiveness, not the clean resolution that grief rarely offers, is the only honest place a story like this can end. Not with an answer, with a man holding his son, staying.